When the letter arrived, Janelle thought it was a cruel joke. She didn't own anything. She barely owned the single backpack she shared with her 2 daughters while moving from shelter to shelter. So when she read the words, "You have inherited a mountain farmhouse," she didn't laugh. She just stared at her daughter's cold hands and whispered, "From who?" The name at the bottom of the document made Janelle freeze. Her grandfather, a man who had vanished from family conversations as if he'd been erased from history. The legal notice claimed the inheritance was a massive estate in the mountains, under an official government seal since 1946. No one had entered it in over 80 years. Janelle read the line again. Sealed. Why would the government lock a farmhouse away for nearly a century? And why leave it to her now, when she was at her lowest point? With nothing left to lose but the pavement beneath her feet, Janelle followed a fading map into the deep woods to find a monument to a past that had been waiting nearly a century for her to arrive. Before we follow Janelle into the shadows of the past to uncover why this house was frozen in time, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the shocking discovery she finds behind that sealed door. The cold bit through Janelle's thin jacket as she sat on the curb, her fingers tracing the jagged edge of her last $20 bill. Between that and the crumpled ones in her pocket, she had exactly $42 to her name. It was the price of a few more nights of cheap, greasy meals or the cost of a one-way ticket out of a city that had already chewed her up and spat her out. Behind her, the shelter was a symphony of heavy breathing and rustling plastic bags, a place where temporary had slowly become a permanent state of survival. She looked at her 2 daughters, their faces smudged but eyes still bright with a trust she wasn't sure she deserved. The eviction and the divorce had taken the roof and the safety, leaving her with nothing but a backpack and a mounting sense of smallness. But the letter in her hand, with its official seal and the promise of a farmhouse frozen in 1946, felt like a lifeline thrown into a dark sea. Janelle stood up, gripping the money tight. She wouldn't spend it on another day of running. She was going to buy their way toward the only thing left, a mountain home no landlord could ever take away. The bus hissed to a stop at the edge of the paved world, leaving Janelle and her daughters at the mouth of a wilderness that seemed to breathe with a heavy, ancient rhythm. As they stepped onto the narrow trail, the silence of the mountains felt less like peace and more like a warning. The path to Pine Hollow was a ghost of a road, choked by tangled briars and the silver-gray skeletons of fallen pines that forced them to climb and crawl through the undergrowth. Janelle adjusted the straps of the backpack, her pulse quickening with every snap of a twig beneath their boots. It wasn't just the thinning air or the way the towering trees knit together to swallow the sunlight, it was the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Her daughters huddled close, their small hands gripping her jacket as the shadows grew long and predatory. Every rustle in the ferns felt like a secret whispered between the trees, a hidden audience observing the outsiders who dared to return to a place the world had agreed to forget 80 years ago. The clearing opened up, revealing a house that defied the decay of the surrounding woods. It was a looming 2-story structure of white-painted wood, now weathered to the color of bone, its windows staring back like blind eyes behind jagged wooden boards. Janelle halted, her daughters huddling behind her as she approached the main entrance. Bolted directly across the heavy oak door was a thick, rusted metal plate, a government seal dated 1946. It felt like a scar on the house, an official decree that the world had simply stopped here. With trembling fingers and a borrowed wrench, Janelle pried at the stubborn bolts. The metal shrieked in protest, the sound echoing through the stagnant air before the seal finally dropped into the dirt with a final hollow thud. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door. It groaned open, releasing a cold, stale draft that smelled of dust, dried pine, and 80 years of silence. Stepping inside, she didn't just walk into a room, she stepped into a ghost of the past. Everything remained poised in mid-motion, as if the inhabitants had only stepped out for a moment, leaving 1946 behind for her to discover. The interior of the farmhouse was a silent museum of a life interrupted. Sunlight, thick with dancing motes of dust, cut through the gaps in the window boards to illuminate a kitchen that felt eerily expectant. Janelle's daughters gravitated toward the pantry, their eyes widening as they discovered rows of glass jars neatly lined upon the shelves. Inside, Preserved peaches and green beans remained suspended in amber liquid, their labels handwritten in a steady, fading script dated August 1946. It was a feast prepared for a winter that the family never got to spend together. While the girls marveled at the edible ghosts of the past, Janelle moved toward a small built-in desk in the corner. Tucked behind a stack of old almanacs was a leather-bound journal. As she opened it, the smell of aged paper filled her senses. The entries were not of mundane farm life, but of growing desperation. Her grandfather had written of H, a man whose promises of partnership felt more like a tightening noose. He spoke of a trap agreement, a legal maneuver designed to strip him of the mountain he loved. The final lines were scrawled with a shaking hand, warning that the truth was hidden where no thief could find it. The journal's frantic scribbles kept drawing Janelle's eyes back to the hearth, the cold heart of the home that felt more like a vault than a fireplace. "The proof is hidden where the warmth ends," the final entry had whispered from the page. Kneeling in the soot of 80-year-old ashes, Janelle ran her trembling fingers over the uneven river stones that made up the massive chimney. Her daughters watched in breathless silence as she pressed against a block that sat slightly off-kilter, a stone that seemed to resist the natural settling of the house. With a sharp grunt of effort, she shoved against the edge until the mortar crumbled, and the heavy rock groaned forward, thudding into the dust. Behind it lay a dark, hollow cavity, shielding a bundle wrapped in heavy, oil-stained cloth. As she unfurled the fabric on the wooden table, the yellowed parchment of original land deeds spilled out, documents covering hundreds of acres of the surrounding peaks. Her breath hitched as she reached the final page, a transfer contract to a development company, dated 1946, left entirely unsigned. The trap had been set, but her grandfather had never walked into it. Deep within the same hidden cavity, Janelle's fingers brushed against a small silver frame. Pulling it into the dim light of the cabin, she wiped away the grime of 8 decades to reveal a photograph of her grandfather as a young man. He stood tall and resolute, but it was the man beside him that caused Janelle's blood to turn to ice. The second man possessed a sharp, predatory smile and eyes that Janelle recognized from the bronze statues and corporate plaques back in the city, the patriarch of the Hollow Ridge dynasty. On the back of the photo, the ink was dark and urgent, scrawled with a heavy hand, "Trust no one." The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. Her grandfather hadn't just been a recluse, he had been a man under siege. This farmhouse wasn't just a home, it was a fortress where he had retreated to keep his legacy out of the reach of hunters. Looking at her daughters, Janelle felt a new, cold clarity. The people who had tried to break her grandfather were still out there, and they had been waiting 80 years for a Martin to return to these woods. The silence of the mountain was shattered by the low, predatory hum of engines. From the porch, Janelle watched as 2 obsidian-black SUVs crawled to a halt at the edge of the clearing, their polished frames looking like alien intruders against the raw bark of the pines. When the doors opened, men in sharp, tailored suits stepped out, well-dressed figures with clean boots that had never known the struggle of a mountain trail. Janelle instinctively pulled her daughters behind her, her hand tightening on the heavy oak doorframe as they approached with the measured patience of wolves. One man held a leather folder like a weapon, his smile professional yet devoid of any warmth. "We represent Hollow Ridge Development," he said, his voice a smooth contrast to the jagged tension in the air. He spoke of compensation and unpredictable mountains, his eyes scanning the cabin with a calculated greed that made Janelle's skin crawl. Every word was a veiled threat, a reminder that they had been watching this sealed tomb for 80 years. But as she felt her daughter's trembling breaths against her back, Janelle's fear calcified into a cold, hard shield. She wasn't just a homeless woman anymore, she was the gatekeeper of a truth they were desperate to bury. The journey back to the city felt like a descent from a sanctuary into a lion's den. Janelle clutched her bag against her chest, the weight of the 1946 deeds feeling like live ammunition. She navigated the sterile fluorescent halls of the county records office, her daughter's footsteps echoing against the marble floors. When the clerk finally pulled the digital archives, the silence in the room became deafening. "There is no finalized transfer on file," the woman whispered, her eyes darting from the screen to the yellowed parchment in Janelle's hands. As the official maps were overlaid with modern property lines, The terrifying truth crystallized. The glittering high-rises and sprawling luxury estates of Hollow Ridge Development were built on a foundation of sand. The developer's entire multi-million-dollar empire sat squarely on land that legally belonged to her grandfather's heir. Janelle realized then that she wasn't just holding a piece of history. She was holding the kill switch for the very family that had spent 80 years trying to erase her own. She wasn't small anymore. She was the owner of the ground beneath their feet. The high-backed leather chairs of the boardroom felt like a different world, but Janelle no longer felt like an intruder. She sat across from the Hollow Ridge executives, her grandfather's 1946 deeds resting on the polished mahogany table like a gavel. The air of intimidation had vanished, replaced by a desperate professional courtesy as the developers realized their entire legacy depended on her signature. Janelle didn't settle for a buyout that would disappear in a few years. She demanded a partnership that ensured her family's future for generations. She secured a percentage of every development on the land and turned the mountain farmhouse into a protected historical site, a permanent sanctuary held in her name. When the final papers were signed, she took her daughters back to the clearing in Pine Hollow. The rusted government seal was gone, replaced by a home that finally breathed with life again. As the girls ran through the tall grass, their laughter echoing against the peaks, Janelle realized that venture was finally over. She had promised them a move that would be their last, and standing on the porch of the house the truth had built, she knew they were finally home.